Rush hour on the Underground and the luxury of the golden age of rail travel would seem to be two concepts at odds with each other. But it was not always so. Today I'd like to take a look at the time when tube trains could be positively posh. When the first Underground line opened in 1863, no one had any inkling that they were pioneering a revolution in commuting. That line, the Metropolitan Railway, was, to all intents and purposes, just another railway. Yes, it ran largely underground, but in every other sense it was a conventional railway. In fact, it was built with sharing its track with conventional trains in mind. In its early days, it even borrowed rolling stock from the mainline companies. Railway travel in the 19th century, like just about everything else in the 19th century, was strictly divided by class. If you were better off, and you didn't want to mix with the rabble, you'd pay a bit extra to ride first class. Of course, you could argue that that was a bit pointless in the early days. The line went from Farringdon to Paddington, hardly enough time to luxuriate in your surroundings. But the railway was soon looking to the northwest of London, and in 1868 a branch from Baker Street to Swiss Cottage was opened. The Metropolitan extended further and further out until, by 1899, it was possible to get a train all the way out to Verney Junction in the wilds of Buckinghamshire, some 50 miles from Baker Street. And if you're travelling that far out, then you might well consider a little luxury to be worth it. The other event that took place in 1899 was the completion of the Great Central Railway, which shared part of the Metropolitan's route into London and terminated at Marylebone. Suddenly, the Metropolitan faced competition, not least in the realm of comfort. The Great Central hoped to poach some of the Met's passengers, and that wouldn't be difficult, given how shabby the Metropolitan's coaches were. So in 1910 they introduced new coaches. These offered more space and a smoother ride. Officially, they were simply known as the main line stock, but unofficially, their size led them to be known as the dreadnoughts. The dreadnought being a state-of-the-art battleship at the time. But as well as the structural advantages, these coaches are, frankly, quite pleasant on the inside. Here's a look at the first-class compartments. Look at that ceiling. The seats are not the most luxurious I've ever felt, but they're certainly comfortable. This is a feature I particularly like. Some of these compartments have adverts for Metroland. The Metropolitan Railway had an associated property development company, and Metroland was the branding they used to entice people to live in the bucolic surroundings of Rickmansworth and Chesham. I guess they figured that if you have to go all the way out to Verney Junction on your commute, you might consider buying a house closer to London. If you want to experience the dreadnoughts for yourself, these ones can be seen at the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway, which is an even longer way from Baker Street. But before the first dreadnoughts had even entered service, the Great Central were preparing their next offensive. In 1909 they signed a contract with the Pullman Car Company. This was an American company who produced their own luxury railway carriages. The founder, George Pullman, had been deeply unimpressed by a cross-country journey in one of the primitive sleeper cars of the 1850s, and decided that he could do better himself. In the opinion of Sir James Allport, he succeeded. Allport was the general manager of the Midland Railway in Britain, and encountered the Pullman carriages on his trips to America. The Midland Railway was a company that couldn't compete with other main lines on speed, and therefore sold their services on comfort. Allport invited Pullman to a directors' meeting, and arrangements were made for Pullman to supply carriages to the Midland. The contract was non-exclusive, and soon other railways were keen to jump on the bandwagon. In Britain, as in America, the name Pullman became synonymous with luxury travel. When the Great Central announced that they too would be bringing Pullman cars into service, alarm bells sounded at Baker Street. In response, the Metropolitan ordered 2 Pullman cars of their own. These 2 carriages do not survive today, but a similar example from the South Eastern and Chatham Railway is preserved at the National Railway Museum in York. The main difference between this and the Met examples is that the Metropolitan coaches were built smaller to fit into the underground tunnels. However, they were still somewhat longer than the standard Metropolitan coaches, and a crossover at Aldgate had to be relayed to accommodate them. The Pullmans were put into service in June 1910. Like other Pullman cars, they were named, in this case Mayflower and Galatea, after racing yachts. I don't know if there's any connection between the luxury carriages being named after yachts and the ordinary coaches being named after battleships. If there is, it's not one I've ever seen acknowledged in any book or article. And if you thought the first-class coaches were luxurious, you ain't seen nothing yet, kiddo. Saloons panelled with oak and mahogany, frosted glass, damask blinds, expensive carpets, electric lighting, attendants who could be summoned by a bell at each table. Oh yes, there were tables too. And a small kitchen to enable light refreshments to be served. And these were the only underground carriages to be fitted with toilets. The carriages were owned by the Pullman Company, but the Metropolitan dictated which services they should be operated on. Typically there would be one Pullman car on some of the longer distance services. The fare was the first-class fare plus an additional sixpence. At first the service was quite popular, particularly with the commuters from Amersham and Chorleywood, but it dropped off after the First World War until the fares were reduced. The other major problem was that the standard Pullman livery of umber and cream did not weather the smoky tunnels well, and the coaches were later repainted crimson. The Metropolitan Railway was taken over in 1933 by London Transport. London Transport was all about standardization, and there was nothing standard about Pullman cars. They were kept in service until the outbreak of the Second World War, whereupon they were withdrawn from service. They were sent to Acton Works, then to Hampton Court Station. Then they were sold to a timber merchant in Hinchley Wood, where they suffered the ignominy of being converted into storerooms. They were scrapped in 1948. The dreadnoughts and the Pullmans weren't the only bit of luxury on the Metropolitan. As I say, first-class accommodation was standard at the time, and even when the first electric trains were introduced in 1905, they included first-class sections. But in 1890 the City and South London Railway had pioneered deep-level tube lines, whose carriages were one class only and whose fares were flat. The Central London Railway opened in 1900 and not only operated on the same principle but used it as a selling point. Other tube lines followed suit, and by the time of the formation of London Transport, the Metropolitan was looking distinctly out of step. The Met viewed itself as a cut above the other underground lines, but the new management saw things differently. First-class travel was abolished in 1941. Whether that's a good thing or not is a matter of perspective. On the one hand, it means more space for ordinary passengers and a simpler fare structure. On the other, I do rather like the idea of sipping a cocktail on the way into Baker Street. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this swanky tale from the tube. If so, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing for more, if you have not already done so. I would like, as ever, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the damask blinds to my carriage windows. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.